The NHL 1974 Amateur Draft was a draft class with a lot to be remembered. It had produced a few of the greatest players to play the game, producing 3 Hall of Famers and 20 NHL All-Stars. However, one thing that is notable about this draft class was that there was a player that stood out from everyone that was drafted. No one could have ever predicted what was going to happen that day. Of the draftees that were based on nationality, there were a total of 240 players that were drafted in North America, 6 from Europe, and 1 from Asia. The sole player was a native from Japan, and his name was Taro Tsujimoto. He was drafted by the Buffalo Sabres in the 11th round, 183rd overall. What made this so significant was that he was considered to be the first player of Asian descent to be drafted in the NHL, but also that it was a hoax made up by the Buffalo Sabres. Why in the world would a team decide to create a fake player, and how did this get approved by the National Hockey League? Well, in order to better understand why the Sabres decided to create this fictional player and how it was even approved, we have to go back and look at the landscape of the NHL and what it was like back in 1974. 2 years prior to the 1974 draft, there was a new professional hockey league that rose and competed with the National Hockey League. With the birth of the World Hockey Association, or the WHA, it began to compete with the NHL, which professional hockey league would dominate. Some strategies the WHA used to take players from the NHL were that they offered higher salaries, and that players also had more freedom to choose where they wanted to play after their contract had ended, where the NHL had strict policies with salaries and ownership on players. On top of all of that, the WHA were stealing their players through the draft by lowering the draft ages to 18 years, where the NHL had it at 20 years old. One strategy of preventing the WHA from stealing players from the NHL draft was holding a draft in secret. In the summer of 1974, the league held the entry draft earlier than its usual time so that they could hold the rights to the players they would draft before the WHA came in and took them. This was all to be conducted for 3 days. Only one issue was how the system ran. Each team had to call in one at a time to announce their player, unlike how it was run today. Everyone can already imagine it was a very long and tedious process, having to make a call, wait until it's your turn, and then pick up your telephone over and over again. The Buffalo Sabres were one of these teams that just did not like how the system was run. By day 2, the Sabres GM had enough waiting and had a bright idea about drafting someone who didn't exist at all. Former Sabres PR director Paul Weiland thought of a name that would stick out. When he suggested that they should pick a player that didn't exist, he decided he wanted to pick a player of Asian descent. They came up with Tsujimoto. He came up with the name Tsujimoto because of a gift shop he used to pass by in college. He gave the store owner a call and asked permission to use the family name, and the store owner agreed. The store owner even suggests the first name being Taro, as it was a common Japanese boy name. The name was able to be processed, and the legend of Taro Tsujimoto was born. Imlach did not acknowledge the fake draft pick just before the start of training camp that year. The team had set up a stall for Tsujimoto and listed him on their training camp roster. This started to get a lot of attention from news reporters and media in the Buffalo area as they wanted to know who was this player. It was said that by GM Punch Imlach that he was a player that played for the Tokyo Katanas of the Japan Ice Hockey League. Of course, no one ever heard of that player before, and no scout at the time actually went to Japan to seek any players there. When the player never arrived to camp, it was eventually announced that he never existed, and that this was supposed to be a statement of frustration on how slow the secretive conference call formats was run. Campbell, the NHL president at the time, did not find this hoax draft pick as funny as Imlach, but it was already too late. The NHL eventually had to change the Sabres pick to invalid claim for its official record-keeping purposes. So, were there any successful players drafted after the Tsujimoto pick? There were 62 more picks after Tsujimoto. Meanwhile, the Sabres had only one more pick in their next round, and out of those 62 players, only 5 of those players played at least one NHL game, 3 of them played over 200 NHL games, and 2 were successful in winning at least 2 Stanley Cups. Assuming they had to pick one of the remaining players in the 1974 draft, the odds were still low at 3%, and that they would come out with at least one of the 2 successful players. It was still very likely that they drafted a player that would never play for them, although, to this day, Tsujimoto has become a legacy of the franchise. The number 74 became infamous for Tsujimoto, referencing the 1974 draft, and would become a part of Sabres history, as fans would chant, "We want Tsujimoto," when home games in Buffalo became very one-sided. It's unfortunate that the whole thing was a hoax, and that it would have been an amazing story to see a Japanese player get a chance to play in the NHL, but it was still one heck of a prank. It was not until 1992 when an actual Japanese player was drafted in the NHL, when the Montreal Canadiens selected Hiroyuki Miura in the 1992 draft, 260th overall, but never played a game in the NHL. The first Japanese-born player to play wasn't until 2007 when a goaltender, Yukata Fukuyuji, was given the opportunity to play with the LA Kings. Since then, there have been several of Japanese heritage to play the game as well. Players such as Paul Kariya and Devin Sadaguchi in the late 90s to mid 2010s, and with more recent players such as Kailer Yamamoto and Nick Suzuki. If you want to learn more about these players, you can check them out on my channel. And if you made it this far, be sure to subscribe. I will also continue to create more content like this in the near future, but in the meantime, I'll see you next time.